CardGamesTV1 Podcast. You learn more from losing than from winning. Because the main thing for me is that, especially in this card game and most other card games, but definitely in this game, it's easy to win. It's not difficult. It's just a matter of making sure you wait for the right moment to go for game, because typically 3 things your opponent needs in order to stop you from winning, right? Blocker, negate, and the ability to out combo your attack. That's all they need. That's typically all they got. Technically there's a 4th way, and that's KOing your battle card during a battle. So you can say 4. That's rare because not many cards are used to KO battle card during that situation. But main thing is, if you play a finisher or you play something you're going to swing for game with, the most typical thing you have to worry about is your opponent using a blocker to block it, using a negate to negate it, or out comboing your attack. So for those 3 basic things, not including the 4th, the possibility that they could have a way of KOing your battle card or bouncing your battle card, whatever, just removing your battle card during battle, is, those are the 3 things you gotta worry about typically. So you gotta make sure that ideally, right, to help deal even with the 4th possibility, having something that has barrier, would be useful, right, or indestructible. So that way you don't have to worry, or use a unison or leader as your finisher, so that way you don't have to worry about them, KOing, which is why I don't, typically mention that as much, and don't even focus on it as heavy, because sometimes, especially I'm leaning towards leader unison finishers than I am battle cards finisher. But if I do go for a battle card finisher, typically I want something with the deflect and barriers, and double strike, and potentially double strike, and hopefully dual attack or more. The idea is to have, is to increase, by having dual attack, you're trying to increase the chances of reducing a blocker and negates getting in your way. That way, because you get that extra attack to try to rely on it. In case they do stop you, your first attack, you have a second one to work with, right? And then double strike, obviously, to do, the last 2 damage necessary for go for game. If you could do more than 2 damage, like triple strike, quadruple strike, obviously those are good as well. But typically, double strike is what you want. And then, of course, you want a way to prevent your opponent from playing blockers. Most people don't play blockers, so that makes that easier. The second thing is, but the thing everybody does tend to play is obviously negates and combo power. So those are the 2 most common things you're going to see a lot, especially when you're going for game. That's what they're typically going to use. They're going to use, some type of free negate. They're going to try to out combo. Obviously, super combo is one of the popular things to combo when you're comboing, obviously. So you're only going to try to use those things, and they've been doing that since set 1, so that's why it's very common, because we've been doing that since set 1, using super combos and negates to survive your opponent trying to go for game. So the idea is you want to be able to bypass that stuff. So that's why it's very important to make sure your opponent's tapped out, so that way they can't play their negates. Obviously, they can combo for free if they have free combo power. So you have to do some combo math in that regards. So make sure the way you tend to mitigate that is by making sure you have way more cards in your hands you can combo than your opponent. So do the combo math, try to figure out how much they could combo, and then make sure you can obviously out combo them, and that will greatly increase your chances of them not out comboing you, because you make sure you can out combo, right? You can make sure you can get your attacks high enough that they can't. So there's that. And then, like I said, make sure they don't have blockers. Typically, you might want to play a finisher that has an ability that board wipes, or that can at least KO a battle card. Board wipe is, obviously more ideal, because if they have multiple blockers, you want to get rid of them all at once. So that's the kind of stuff you look for to help you, seal in the deal. But also at the same time, if by doing the whole board wipe thing, if you don't manage to go for game, at least you cleared the board. So you did two things at once. You cleared the board as well as you're going for game, but you didn't succeed. At least you cleared the board, so that way the clapback wouldn't be as devastating. So it wouldn't be too obvious that you're going to lose on the following turn, right? If you do lose, it happens, but at least you're reducing the possibility of losing. You don't want it to be like, oh, since I didn't win this turn, I definitely lose next turn. You know what I mean? You want to be like, I might survive next turn, right? Because you still have the ability to try to play free negates, out combo your opponent's attacks. Sorry. So you have the possibility of, surviving. Plus, if you're like me, you tend to have higher life points, higher life than your opponent. So your opponent's like at 2 when you're trying to go for game, and you're still like around 6 or 5 life. So, you got a cushion there with your life, and then if you can combo and negate, your chances of surviving that turn is a lot higher than if you didn't board wipe, right? So these are the simple basic things to keep in mind when you're playing, and especially when you're trying to go for game, because the main goal is to try to get to that point where it's like, okay, my opponent's at 2 life, can I go for game now, or do I have to wait? And that's all you're really doing is planning when are you going to win. It's not about if you're going to win or not. No, it's planning out when you're going to win. When is the best time for you to win? Because if you try to go for game too early, that could be literally when you lose. So that's why, I said it's like, winning ain't easy. Winning is easy, right? If you do it right. But the way you don't win is by losing, right? The most common way you don't win is by losing, right? Losing before you even get a chance to win. So that's why you learn more from losing. So the whole point here I'm trying to make is that when you lose against a certain deck, let's say you're playing against Soul Strike or something like that, or King Piccolo deck, or a Hatchiac deck or something like that, right? Like, let's say these are the types of decks you're dealing with, Boma, the list goes on. So you're dealing with certain decks, and you see how you lost. Now let's say you lost like around turn 4, maybe turn 5, and if the reason it was largely because you try to go for game, you don't succeed in winning, so then now it's your opponent's turn, and then they do a clapback. Let me use Shenron as an example. The Shenron deck, the yellow Shenron, pays 6, bringing a whole bunch of Shadow Dragons from the drop, right? Well, obviously that right there lets you know that when it's about to be your opponent's turn 6, right, which is usually after your turn 5. So you're on turn 5, you're doing your thing, and then it's your opponent's turn, then they end up on turn 6, right? Typically. So if they end up on turn 6 after you, they could pay 6 and fill up the board, and then try to go for game, right? Remember, they still got the possibility of free negates. They got super combos, and since they're playing yellow, they have access to sell Zeno. So in that type of situation, they're in a very good situation. So them tapping out is not a problem, because they have a higher chance of going for game. That's why it's their win column, right? So since they're once they get on to turn 6, that's what they more likely will do, and that's what you have to deal with. You might not want to tap out on turn 5, right? You might not want to tap out. You want to win before they get to be able to pull off that strategy, right? So that's why on turn 5 you want to go for game, but you don't want to be defensive. So don't tap out trying to go for game, because you want to win before they get a chance to for them to win. But if you don't win, right? That's the whole thing. If you don't win, well, they do win, right? So that's why you gotta be careful. That's why, like, if you're playing yellow, if you're playing yellow or green or even red, there's obviously almost every color has a flying nimbus, right? A violent raise, as it were, and dormant potential, right? So most colors have their floodgate negate for the turn, right? Baby Hatchiac or something for blue, right? So or some type of ultimate that can blanket protect you for the turn. So since that's a possibility, you know, you can, you know, obviously try to go for game, and if you have that, you have a fighting chance to survive your opponent's next turn. But if you don't, obviously you want to keep your defenses up and try to have the, you know, the violent rays, the red potentials, right, the flying nimbuses and stuff like that. So depending on the color you have, you might want to have one of those types of negates, floodgate negates, to help you in that type of situation. So against, you know, Sin Shenron, obviously turn 5 for you is not the best time to tap out. So that's something you learn, right, from playing. It's like, yes, I tapped out, and now they're on turn 6, and now they're going with their leader's effect. That's a problem, right? Exactly. Which is why you want to make sure you keep those types of information in mind. You know, keep that stuff in mind. For example, let's say Soul Striker. You definitely, more likely, they probably have Android 17 turn tide, or any blue deck probably has access to Android 17 turn of the tides. You might want to avoid, obviously, tapping out on turn 6, right? So then when it's their turn 7, they drop Android 17 turn tide. Granted, turn and tide is going to have a big effect on your hand, but that's more reason why you want to make sure you put up a good amount of blockers on the field, right? So on your turn 6, you want to make sure you have some blockers, maybe blocker unisons, more my style right there, right? So put up some blocker unisons, like a Reddit's Giant Force, for example, or something like that. Or some type of floodgate unison, like Vegeta, Unison of Fury, something like that, and then trigger that effect. That way you can at least, if you still get hit by Android 17, at least you don't lose that turn immediately. That's what I'm trying to say. So you want to prepare for that. So if you ever lost to Android 17 turn tide, yeah, pretty much know it's like, okay, now I know what I got to do to avoid losing to that, right? To that outcome. And of course, I'm mainly mentioning like finishers and ways you typically lose, because typically that's what a lot of us play to do, is to win through a certain card, like through Cell Zeno or Android 17 turn tide, or some type of overrealm play, or something like food, banisher, or something like that, right? Or something we try to use something, Mirror Creative Absorb Champas combo or something like that. Always trying to find some way to just play one thing and go for game, right? Because a lot of times you don't want to rely on a whole bunch of cards to try to win out a game, because you know hand destruction is a thing. So if your opponent withers down your hand down to like 2 or 3 cards, you want one of those cards to be a win con by itself, not have to be in combination with other cards. You know, just like the idea of like, oh, so you're my leader and combo a whole bunch of cards from my hand to go for games. Like, yeah, that sounds great when you can draw like 30 plus cards easily in a game, right? But when your opponent is, you know, you're playing, you don't draw that much. Your opponent is playing some hand control. The likelihood of you getting a nice thick hand to outplay your opponent is, you know, it becomes very slim. So when you end up in that type of scenario, you can't rely on the whole having a big hand size as your win con. Can that be a win con? Yes, of course. But that's not always going to be a win con. So you got to have some alternative. That's why it's good to have more than one way of winning. Yes, you could win by having a bigger hand size than your opponent and go for game. You know, you can win by going wide. You can win by going tall, right? You can win through effects, burn, 17 turn size, cells down on you, stuff like that. Like, you know, reducing your opponent's hand size and then going for game. You know, like with like or like cell force perfection of force, or force of perfection, something like that. Perfect force cell. There you go. Perfect force cell, right? And then just wither your opponent's hand down to 3, and then activate some effects, wither it down even further down to like maybe 1 card in your opponent's hand, go for game type stuff, right? So, you know, that's why it's very important to remember how you lost, because that's how you're going to learn to win more than the times you won. Because a lot of times you won because you got lucky, or your opponent messed up. You know, they misplayed and set themselves up for a loss. Like they tapped out at the wrong time, and then you got an easy win. And that's the thing. A lot of times you lose just because you tapped out. Tapped out at the wrong turn, right? You tapped out, hoping. A lot of times you're hoping that you're good. It's like, I doubt my opponent's it's gonna kill me on the next turn, so it's okay if I tap out. And then suddenly they have the ability to kill you. They have some elaborate combo. They get a whole bunch of attacks, and you're like, oh, okay, I should not have tapped out. Especially if you got stuff like Violent Rage, Flying Nimbus, stuff like that. Especially if you have those in your hand, you really don't want to be in a scenario where it's like, damn, I should have just kept one energy up. It'll suck if you have Topo, right? Righteous 8, but you didn't keep 2 energy up for it. If you have Oceanus, at least Oceanus, right? That's generic. Anyone can play Oceanus in the deck. You didn't keep 2 energy up, right? So those are unfortunate scenarios. Another thing is if you don't play a leader that untaps 2 energy, or at least untaps 1 energy, or you awaken too early. That's another thing. Awakening too early. Awakening, untapping energy, right? And then use that energy to do stuff. Now you're tapped out, and then when your opponent's turn is like, oh man, I should have saved my awakening, because then I could have untapped that 1 energy that I needed for a fucking Violent Rage or something. You know what I mean? So little things like that matters. That's why it's important to pay attention to how you lose, and then learn from it. Obviously, that's the whole point. Learn from how you lost. Not only learn from your losses, also learn from your opponent's losses. Because like I said, if you notice your opponent, is playing a certain deck, and they tapped out on a certain turn, and you're like, and you see that they gave you an advantage, keep that in mind, because in case you end up playing that type of deck, or a deck similar to that deck, you'll be like, well, I know that turn 3 is not the best time to tap out. Or turn 2, might not be the best time to tap out, and that's another thing. Some decks, depending on if it's an aggro deck or if it's a control deck or something like that, right? Tapping out or not tapping out, or waiting a turn. Like sometimes just waiting 1 turn, just 1 more turn, just next turn I'll try to do this. At least I can do this play that I want to do, but then still keep my defenses up. Like you might want to play your 3-drop on turn 3 and do a good amount of damage to your opponent, but that could literally be the reason you lost. Because instead of waiting to turn 4, where you can make that play and then Flying Nimbus, and then have an energy for negate at least, right? To greatly increase your chances of surviving that turn, so that way on turn 5 you can obviously do a bigger play and go for game. So instead of trying to play your turn 4, especially if you have a turn 4 win con, for example, like a turn 4 finisher, wait until turn 5 to finish the game. Don't try to finish on turn 4. I know it'd be nice to do it on turn 4, but sometimes patience rewards those who are patient, right? And that's another thing about this game is that after turn 3, it's about patience. It's about paying attention to what your opponent's doing, assuming what your opponent could do, and preparing for it, right? Plan for the worst, hope for the best, right? Don't be too quick to be like, yes, I got to turn 1, got to do this. Turn 2, got to do that. Turn 3, 4, 5, got to do everything in a specific order, and don't change at all, right? It's like, well, you don't know what your opponent's going to do. You don't know how your opponent's playing their deck. Depending on how your opponent plays their deck, that can drastically change how you should play your deck. So that's the thing. A lot of people sometimes forget that they're playing against an opponent. And they tend to play their decks a little bit solitaire. I tend to do that sometimes. Some people pointed that out, that I tend to play, and the way I think about the game, I tend to think of it more of a solitaire style game. And it's not that I don't take my opponent's actions or deck choices or whatnot to account. I do. It's just that I know that it's that I know what my deck is capable of doing, what I'm capable of doing, and I focus on that more, making sure that is consistent. Making sure I consistently can do the same things that I'm trying to do every time I play, and then have that carry me throughout all my matches. Instead of worrying about why my opponent played a turn 1 green unison, granted that could mean charismatic villain Frieza, but who cares? I don't care. Like, just because that is what they're doing doesn't mean I have to change the way I play just because that small little detail, right? You know, more likely what I'm doing the first 2 to 3 turns anyway is, you know, probably trying to set up a unison or something. So charismatic villain Frieza is of no importance, and most of my first 4, at least the first 4 damage, is probably going to be done through my leader and unison anyway. That it's not that big of a deal if they're going to have charismatic villain Frieza. Frieza only matters, right, or that type of situation, that I only have to worry about that later when I'm like, okay, I'm going to drop a battle card or something. That's when I have to worry about it. Same thing for like Godzilla and Trunks. I don't have to worry about that until late in the game. So I don't have to change my first couple turns just because my opponent played something on, you know, played a unison on their first turn, and it's like, oh man, that must mean they must have a charismatic villain Frieza or a this or that. Like, I don't have to worry about those little things until later in the game anyway, right? Typically mid to late game is the only time I really gotta worry about it. You know, turn 3, turn 4 type of stuff, or 5 and above. That's when I have to worry about it. So I don't. That's the point. I don't worry about something until it's close to time to worry about it. Like, I don't worry about Android 17 turn tides, turn 1, turn 2, turn 3. No. It's when I'm on turn 5, I'm like, I made it to turn 5. Woo! 2 more turns. He's coming. 2 more turns, you know what I mean? If I'm on turn 5 and I haven't yet won, he's coming. So, you know, I gotta prepare for it and stuff like that. For example, like Zeno, definitely gotta worry about that hitting the field. If I'm going against a yellow or green deck, you know, I gotta make sure that, you know, when I'm on my turn 4, I try to keep some defense up, right? Keep some energy up, so don't try to go in for game on turn 4, because if I fail to go for game on turn 4, then on my opponent's turn 5, woo, sell Zeno for game, right? That it could be a possibility, especially if I didn't board wipe. Let's say my opponent has a couple battle cards in play. That's a sell Zeno potential right there. Might not want to give your opponent a sell Zeno play. That's another thing, is making moves and decisions that, you know, can help prevent you from losing because of the fact that you've learned from your mistakes before, right? You learn that, yeah, against a green and yellow deck, it's not a good idea to let your opponent build up their board because it could lead to a sell Zeno, right? Obviously, anytime after turn 3, turn 2, I should say. So when your opponent has 3 energy or more, the possibility of an ultimate, like a Hatchiyak, Baby Hatchiyak being played, Pan, Time Maiden being played is a high possibility. So you want to keep that in mind. You know, that's why I always point out and always talk about the idea of the first 2 turns being very important turns to try to deal the most amount of damage. You know, you definitely want to try to do up to 6 damage at least on the first 2 turns of the game, because after that it's going to be harder to deal damage. Not impossible, of course not, obviously, but it's going to be harder. And that's the whole point. It's going to be harder, which is why it's important for you to learn from your losses, right? Not only from your losses, but from your opponent's losses. Not just your opponent's losses, but even other people's losses. A lot of times, you know, I watch, you know, gameplay of other people play, and, you know, I pay attention to what, you know, decisions they're making, and then I'm like, yeah, this doesn't look like a good idea for you to tap out this turn. Then I see what their opponent does in response, and it's like, yep, that's why. Another thing about, you notice I mentioned tap out a lot. The thing is, I always talk about wait until your opponent's tapped out to go for game. This is why it's very important for you to be careful about tapping out, for example. You know, tapping out is a very common mistake, if you want to call it that, mistake that players make, whether you're an experienced player or not. Obviously, if you're a new player or a noob, you're more likely to tap out more often than not. Like, you'll tap out a lot because every turn you feel like you gotta play something, and I know how that feels. I know that feeling. Every turn I gotta do something. I gotta make a play. Just like charging energy every turn. There's times where it's a bad idea to charge. Like, for example, against hand control. Woo! so many times I had to give up charging because my hand size was so low. I literally, if I charged, I couldn't do anything. And since I couldn't do anything, the chances of me losing was way higher. I had a better fighting chance when I was like, okay, no charge. That's why it's important to, when you build your decks, to make it where you don't need a lot of energy. So that way you're never in a situation where if the game is going a little bit longer than you expect, you don't end up in a, like, damn, I gotta keep charging. Like, you don't, like, I know you might have Android 17 turn tides in your deck, and you want to get to 7th energy to play him. That would be nice. But if you're playing against hand control, that's not an ideal strategy. So you might want to settle for something a little bit simpler. Like, you might want to settle for a 3 or a 4-drop unison. So, you know, you might want to stop charging after 4 or 5, right? And just keep as much as you can. Especially if you have unisons that let you draw cards, so you can, you know, fill your hand back up. Then yeah, stop charging, keep cards, play cards, right? Draw cards. Hopefully your leader draws when it swings. So try to get more cards in your hands and try to, you know, counteract the fact that your opponent's hand controlling you, and try to stay in the game as much as possible. I've done that a couple times because I've played against hand control a good amount of times, and that's, you know, the kind of stuff that on the fly, you know, from experience, that, you know, I had to incorporate. But at the same time, you know, when you build your decks and you build it to play a certain way, that already helps you mitigate certain strategies like hand control. You know, some people who do actually, you know, watch my videos properly, right, and actually listen to me talk in my videos, and realize that me talking in the videos is important because there's always information there that's beyond the deck list. Way more information when you hear me talk than to just look at my deck list and judge it. You hear stuff like, okay, the reason why I have these cards in the deck is because these cards actually help against hand control. See, so many players are focused on the idea of, like, trying to negate somebody playing effects that you know, that discard effects from the opponent's hand. So they'll play certain, you know, tech cards like, oh yeah, this card is good against hand control. It's like, yeah, because its effects states your opponent can't make you discard cards from your hand. Like, so yeah, clearly that was made for that effect, you know, to counter basically hand control. But there are other ways you can deal with hand control. You don't have to negate it or counter it. There are other ways you can play around it. You can play cards that work in the drop area, so it doesn't matter that you ended up discarding it. Cards that work in the warp, in case they're using warp hand control effects instead. Obviously, draw effects. Have a lot of draw effects in your hand, right? So you can always keep your hand size. That way you always have a hand size. While your opponent's trying to reduce your hand size, you can always try to fill it back up, right? Try to play cards that are cheap, like 1-drop, 2-drops. Try to play a lot of 1-drops and 2-drops, so that way you have a better chance of playing all your cards before your opponent even gets a chance to start activating effects to you know, to get rid of cards from your hands. So these are the things that I take to account that most people don't think I take to account, but I do. I take these things to account. So when I build my decks, I build them with these things in mind. So that way, when I play, no matter what deck I'm playing against, if I end up going up against hand control, at least I'm like, okay, well, at least I know how to deal with hand control. At least I know how to play against it. Just like playing against unisons. I try not to waste any attacks on unisons. I just keep swinging at my opponent's leader. Just keep swinging until I win, right? Totally ignore the fact that my opponent has a unison. Just keep swinging for game, right? Keep swinging away. So, but if I'm not careful, the unison could be literally the reason I lose, just because I left it there way too long. So that's why it's important to, you know, pay attention. So if you play a game and you were like doing really good, but then you suddenly lost, it's like, oh damn, what the hell happened? It's like, oh, the unison was on the field too long, you know, as an example, right? And then you learn from that, right? And then you'll, you know, try to figure out a way to deal with the unison next time, but not give up, you know, the game plan, right? You know, the idea of just swinging, you know, at your opponent. But sometimes you gotta change the game. Sometimes you gotta play the game a little bit longer than you want to. You know what I mean? I like to win fast or lose fast, whichever one happens, right? But typically, I'd rather win, right? But that's the thing. If you really want to win, sometimes you can't win fast. Sometimes you gotta win slow. Sometimes you gotta take time. You know, you gotta wait until the right turn to win, because sometimes it's not turn 2, it's not turn 3, turn 4 that you win. It might be turn 7 that you win, right? And it could have been, and it could literally have been right after your opponent entered 17 turn tides, for example. You managed to survive that turn with 1 life or some shit. Your turn, draw, bang. You charge the 7th energy, right? And now you're like, oh, I got this combo right here. I can use to go for game, and then go for game. That could literally happen, right? The combo could be like obviously something on the field, maybe something in your drop, and then your leader, maybe awakening effect, in case it's a draw 2 leader, for example, or something like that. And then of course you swing with the leader, you draw another card, so you could easily refill your hand. That's another thing. Using your leader's awakening draw abilities or attacking to draw abilities as a counter to your opponent's hand control. So obviously back to the little hand control thing, but that's the thing. It's like in general you can take advantage of that. That's why it's important not to awaken so early. That's why if you are patient, right, and you know well, ironically, awakening late game is always better than awakening early. Too many people are quick to awaken, and ironically that tends to put them in a bad situation. They think they're in a positive, advantageous situation when they awaken before their opponent, but in reality they're not. That's a temporary advantage, right? Sorry, that's a temporary advantage, right? Because now you're stronger than your leader, stronger than your opponent's leader, so you can apply pressure without comboing, for example. And it puts your opponent in a position where they have to combo if they don't want to take damage. So that's why they like the idea of getting to awakening as soon as possible, so they could try to take advantage of that. But but realistically, saving your awakening for late game as your comeback, as your turning the tables strategy, where it's like time to turn the tables, time for me to come back into the game, is important. Because I've done that before, where I save my awakening for after my opponent played Cell, the whole Cell chain thing back in the day. So when they dropped Cell, or they played the Gogeta 7-drop to wreck your hand size, I will save my awakening for when that happens, just because I know that can happen. Same, and the new version is Android 17 turn size, so that's the new the new hand destroyer, right? So that's why when I play against blue, I try to make sure that especially if my leader is a draw 2 leader, I try to make sure I save it for after Android 17 turns the tides. Unless I'm in a position where if I don't awaken, I lose, then I do, gotta do what you gotta do, right? Not to lose. Try to stay in the game as long as possible. That way you have a higher chance of winning by staying in the game longer. But if I can get away with not awakening, all the way up to turn 5 or 6 or something like that, then that's great. That right there shows a lot about your skill level if you can save your awakening until late in the game. If you're awakening early, you're compensating for something, clearly. If you're trying to awaken as soon as turn 1 or 2, you're clearly compensating. I can wait. Patience is a virtue, it's a strength, it's a superpower, right? It's an advantage, it's a strategy, right? Start to win, as they say, right? So that's why it's good to not just watch, because I know sometimes some people will watch like a gameplay and then they'll see the person lose and then be like, oh man, this was a waste of time, blah blah blah, You know, it's like, oh, the person lost. It's like, yeah, but if you pay attention, you know, you will see that they actually was in a position where if this was an ideal situation, they obviously would have won if it was ideal. But fortunate for their opponent, their opponent was able to survive that turn, was able to not lose, but they easily could have lost. That's the whole point. It's important to pay attention. Just because the person lost doesn't mean they could not have won. It's not like they were in a situation where they definitely could not win. It was they definitely had the ability to win. They just, you know, their opponent had what they needed, right? Their opponent lucked out. I had one scenario one time where it's like my opponent had like 3 life, if I'm right, and then I dealt them 2 damage, so they were down to 1, and now they have 2 cards in their hands, right? Because it's like, I think I double striked them, so now they got 2 cards in their hands, and then I was going to go for game, right? I only had like 1 attack left, and I was going for game. I was like, oh, I'm going to go for game. I'm going to dump my whole hand into that attack, right? And guess what happened? Guess what happened? Baby Hatchet hit the field. They ended up having Baby Hatchet and another card in their hand, obviously, because they have 2 cards in their hands, right? To play Baby Hatchet, and they were able to survive that turn. Ain't that about a beep? I actually had other attacks. I actually did have other attacks. That's what made me extra unhappy, was that I actually had other attacks. It's not like I only had 1 attack. I actually had other attacks. It's just that because Baby Hatchet prevents me from attacking with my other cards, I couldn't go for game, even though I was in a, you know, winning position. So that can happen, right? Yeah, lucky my opponent had Baby Hatchet. But if it wasn't for that, you know, they would have lost right there and then. So they were able to get back in the, you know, make a comeback, right? They were able to get back in the game, use their leader, add cards to their hands. They play some other cards, and you know, they play some the Goku Instincts apes from their drop, and refill their hands. So they were able to make a comeback just because of that 1 card. 1 card out of a 50 card deck made a huge difference for them. I had game. I had a win. I had the advantage to win. They just had the ability to not lose, and that's how they won. Right? They won because they didn't lose. I think I lost that game. Don't remember, but more likely I probably lost. Which is why I remember the Hatchiac part so vividly. Is I probably lost, just because I should have won but didn't. But that's why it's important to learn from your losses, and and keep things like that in mind. Like, for example, I learned that I gotta be careful to try to avoid overextending, even though I'm in a very great, like almost perfect storm win condition, because literally my opponent's hand is 0 and they got 3 life. I got a whole bunch of attackers, and I'm like, yo, this is game. This is final turn. There's a possibility that they could make a comeback, especially if they have like an energy and you deal them damage, and now they're like, oh, I can Violent Raise or something, or Flying Nimbus. It's like, good for you, or maybe a Topo play or something. Like, that's why you gotta be careful. That's why typically, ironically, from that type of battle, I've learned that I need to make sure that my double strike is double strike crit, right? I need to make sure that if I can help it, right? If I can help it, make sure that my finishers have crit. Ideally, I want double strike crit, right? The ability to do 2 damage, but make sure my opponent doesn't gain no cards from that, right? So double strike crit, ideally. That's why playing something that has critical and then using like Champa to give it double strikes, so that way I have double strike crit, is something I would want. And that's and like I said, you learn from your losses, because even though the situation I was in was pretty good, and the mathematical likelihood of me not winning, the mathematical likelihood of me not winning that turn when it was like a perfect turn, right, where, like, if I'm right, my opponent was tapped out, so even if they drew a negate, it, unless it's a sparking negate, they weren't going to be able to play it. They weren't going to be able to topo me or anything like that because they were tapped out. So they were tapped out, no blockers. They had no hand size except for the 2 cards they just gained from one of my attacks, which was a double strike attack, right? So ideally, I was in a good position. All my attacks had a higher chance of going through, but Baby Hatchet says no, and that's the whole point, right? He says no. You shall not pass. So, again, like I said, you gotta learn from your losses, and it's what makes you a better player. Learning from your losses, not just yours, but also from anyone else. The main thing is learn from losing, because the thing is about learning from losing, right? Is the whole, you know what not to do, right? Because ideally, people want to know what to do, right? Like, oh, how can I play this deck and do this and do it? How can I win with this deck? How can I win with it? A lot of people focus on how they can win with a deck way more than how they can not lose with a deck. It's like, you might want to learn both, right? Yes, it's important to know how to play Cell Zeno, for example, or Enter 17 Turn Tides to try to go for game. Gotcha. You want to know how to play that. But once you learn that, that's easy, right? That's the easy part. Knowing how you want to win, right? Having your win con built into your deck, ready to roll, right? It's just a matter of playing out the game, right? Playing out the cards and getting the win through your strategy, through your deck's strategy. But learning how not to lose, learning what not to do is way more important than learning what to do, because learning what to do, everybody does that, right? No one typically tries to learn, how to do things the wrong way, right? No one tries to learn how to do things wrong. Typically, people want to learn how to do things right. But even when you do everything right, even when you're in the perfect scenario like I was in, where all I have to do is just attack and game, and it should be game, Baby Hatchet can appear. A wild Baby Hatchet can appear. Right? I had a scenario where my opponent was all tapped out, and I think he had maybe 3 to 4 cards in the hands, and it's like the likelihood of them being able to out combo me is very low. So the only thing they could try to do is stop me with a negate. But since they're tapped out, I'm good, so I'm going for game. And I try to go for game, and they spark and negated me, and like, oh, that's what it was. I dealt them damage. No, that's what it was. Yeah, they had that. No, I'm getting a couple matches mixed up. No, they had like 1 card in the hand at that point, and then I'm like, all right, swing, dealt them damage. I think I swung with the leader, so they added the cards in the hand. So then there were 2 cards. And then when I went to go swing with my finisher, or I was trying to go for game, then they spark and negated me. And I was like, and the way it looked on tapped is like, that looks like the card you just added to your hand. You just played it. So that's unfortunate that your life gave you a way of going saving yourself from this final attacks. I think what it was is that my opponent had like 2 life left, and I was going for double strike damage, so they were able, because of the sparking negate, right? So they had 2 life. I'm trying to go for double strike, and then they sparking, take a life, and was able to stop my attack. So they ended up still having 2 cards in the hands, and they still had 1 life left, and I was not able to finish them off that turn, so I had to end my turn, and they were able to, stay in the game longer. So that's why it's important to, learn from your losses, so that we can improve and make better card choices. Because if you have, I'm trying to think of something. If you, let me see. Well, better card choices in general. I was trying to come up with an example of like a card you can, like obviously something with barrier, just to try to prevent. Like, okay, I use Shigesh as an example. Back in the day, people used to use Shigesh to bring out this 3-drop Kid Goku, who had the effect, the auto that when you play him, you KO battle card, and that was very powerful because you can play it after your opponent combos, right? They attack, they combo, Then it's your turn to combo. You combo Shigesh, drop the Kid Goku. Kid Goku KOs the battle card that they attack with. And there you go. Now you didn't have to combo anything else. It just took you 2 cards from your hands to beat your opponent. Especially if your opponent was like, yeah, I dropped my whole hand. My hand size is bigger than yours. My attack is 100k. Double strike. I'm going to win. And then you're like, Shigesh, Kid Goku, pop. And then your opponent's like, OMG. I just wasted my whole hand on one attack and it didn't even go through. Like, yep. So if the battle card had barrier, or if it was the leader, obviously people learn real quick that, okay, if I'm going to do that whole attack, dump my whole hand into an attack strategy, I have to use my leader. So people caught on quick to, you know, try to use their leader as their finisher in the Shigesh format, as it were, or Shigesh arrow. But you get my point. It's like, once, you know, barriers start coming into the game, then it's like, okay, now, you know, barrier and stuff like that, you know, make sure that if I have a finisher, one that has deflect, that's obviously one of the things people started adopting. It's like, oh shit, guys, Trunks is a thing, I need a finisher that has deflect, you know, right? Charismatic and Frieza, I need a finisher that has barrier, right? So that's why we typically look for battle cards that have both deflect and barrier. Then they made the card type unison, so it's like, okay, Godzilla Trunks and Charismatic Villain Frieza only works on battle cards, so use a unison as a finisher instead, and, you know, or leader, right? And that helps us, you know, deal with that stuff. So that's the thing, you know, you learn from, you know, certain situations. You learn from the possibility of your opponent being able to do something, so you try to adapt. That's the whole idea of learning from losing. You know, you adapt from your L's more than you do from your W's. Your W's, you know, it's the whole consistency. Oh, I won. I just gotta keep doing this and I keep winning. So when you win, you tend to just want to keep doing the same thing, right? If it ain't broke, don't fix it, right? You're not going to adapt after you win something. After you win, you're not going to adapt and change how you play, because you're more likely going to lose, right? You want to keep winning, so you're going to keep playing the same way to keep getting that result. But losing is different. You lose is like, okay, how did I lose? Why did I lose? And try to figure out what's the best way to not lose next time, right? How not to make the same mistakes, how not to lose. So when it comes to losing, you adapt from that more than you would adapt from winning. So winning makes you complacent, losing makes you a champion, makes you ever evolving, ever growing, you know. And that'll be the end of the podcast.